for having me here today. My name is Owosina, and I'll be sharing some of our experiences using the dynamic adaptive policy pathway approach in our planning for flood risk management in South Florida. I'm going to give this talk essentially in three parts. The first part is going to kind of tell you the why. It's going to describe the district, what our mission is, and what the challenges that we face. Then the next will tell you what we did, and then the last part will kind of tell you some of the challenges we faced and some of the outstanding issues we're still trying to resolve. Okay. So who's the South Florida Water Management District? The South Florida Water Management District is the oldest and the largest of 5 regional water districts in Florida. We've been around since 1949, a slightly different name, but our history actually goes back beyond that as completely different organizations that were set aside when the district came into being. Our mission is to safeguard the resources of South Florida, looking at water resources and ecosystem, protecting communities from flooding. We have a water supply mission element as well, and doing this in a public way. To achieve this, I'm going to focus today's talk on the flooding, though interesting, yesterday I listened to the Delaware River presentation and realized that some of the challenges with regards to saltwater management and water supply planning is actually exactly the same type of work that we're doing. But today's talk will be focused on flooding. And for the flooding piece, I'm going to be talking to you about the Central and Southern Florida project. In 1947, there were severe storms in Florida that resulted in significant flooding and loss of life. And a lot of parts of South Florida were flooded in excess of about 5 to 6 months. The state of Florida asked the federal government for some help, and the Congress authorized the Central and Southern Florida project. That project was built by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers over the next 20 or so years. Includes more than 2,000 miles of canals, 2,000 miles of levees, serves about 160 major drainage basins, and includes more than 1,000 structures. And today's talk is going to be focused on some of those structures, especially the ones that are coastal structures. So I'm going to try to set the why really with this. I'm showing a map to the left of South Florida. And the dots in red or green are coastal structures. These are salinity barriers. They are gated spillways or gravity structures. They go along our coastline. Anything downstream of them is directly connected to the ocean. And there's a picture on the right that shows one of those gated spillways. Now, I might use a few technical terms. I don't know the makeup of the room, but in case there are non-engineers, I'm going to kind of take care of some of my jargons up front. This is a schematic looking through a typical gated spillway. The big gray concrete in the middle is your superstructure, and the red represents gates that you can lift to let water through or lower to close. The area to your left represents the upstream area, or the headwaters as it might be called in a gravity structure. In eastern Southeast Florida, it's where we mostly live. It's the inland part. And the water flows from that part by gravity to the area to the right, which is the downstream or tailwater part. And for a gravity structure, you want your headwater to be higher than your tailwater, and the structures will move water in the correct direction. The operation is a little bit complicated, but there's a way to simplify it to make my case. Assume that there are 2 levels that we base our operations on. Now, there are a lot more, and my water managers will be very upset, but this works. You have an elevation at which you open the gate and one at which you close the gate. If you have, under normal conditions, you'll have your gate closed. You're holding on to water. In Florida, with the flat conditions, you want to hold on to as much water as you can without draining it to tide. But if it is in the wet season and it rains, your inland area would fill up. The canals will elevate, and you'll open the gate to manage that elevation, because uncontrolled, it increases your flood risk. Eventually, the event ends and the water levels will drop. And when they do, you get to get close elevation at which you want to close the gate because you don't want to overdrain. And part of the risk of overdraining is if you drop the water table sufficiently, you might induce saltwater intrusion, or you might have flows coming into your system that's undesirable. So what we're beginning to see more and more is that with sea level rise and the appropriate king tides, you're having conditions when your tailwater elevation exceed the gate open elevation. And under these conditions, if you have a rainstorm, you would actually not be able to open the gate because with the gravity structure, it's an equal opportunity passer of flows. Flow would come from the ocean side into the inland side, contaminating the aquifers, potentially putting water supplies at risk. Now, this might seem like some kind of, distant future, but it's not really for us. The video I'm going to show you here is a snippet that was captured a few years ago with the king tide and the wind just right. You actually have a structure that's supposed to be flowing from right to left, and you can see that the water is actually coming back over the closed gate. So the system I described to you is a primary system. The primary system is the one that the district and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is responsible for. But flood control in South Florida is managed through a three-tiered system where the primary system takes water from the secondary system and sends it out to tide or to storage for restoration purposes. But the secondary system collects water from the tertiary system, which is actually where people live. So homeowner associations and large landowners manage their stormwater ponds. That's part of the tertiary system. They discharge into canals that is run by local government or special drainage districts. That's part of the secondary system. And they in turn discharge the primary system. So for flood control to work in a region, we need to all be working together to make the system work. And for that, we had to take a total system approach. Now, what are the sources of uncertainty? You've heard many of them over the last 2 days. I'm going to summarize a few here. Climate, clearly we're all thinking about climate. And in South Florida, with the gravity structures, sea level rise is a real problem that we're dealing with. And the uncertainty of predicting how much rise you'll have is one of the big uncertainties we have to deal with. Rainfall is another. And storminess and the effect of storm surge is another that we know that we have to manage and include in some of our thinking and analysis. Another one for us is land use and development changes. When the CNSL project was built, it was projected to serve a population of about 2 million people. Today serves a population of about 9+ million people. And many of the areas that were designed to be maybe agricultural fields or open areas where you could store water are now cities, which during rain events have to shed water. A third area, which is an interesting one for us, is the fluid nature or the changing expectations of our stakeholders and the societal norms with regards to what they would accept to provide flood control. 30 years ago, it was simple. You safely send water to tide, and that's flood control. Today, we couldn't do a project that sends water to tide without looking at the water quality impacts on the receiving water system. There are a few other things along those lines, but these are all uncertainties that affect our planning process. To be able to plan adequately, we have to actually modify the traditional planning approach. There are many good parts of the traditional planning approach that we retained. And on here, I'm kind of trying to show you some key distinctions between what we do now and what we used to do in the past. In the past, you plan for a future date. You try your best to get things projected accurately for that date, amount of rise, amount of water use, what would be in place. We've kind of found that could be somewhat limiting, especially with the uncertainty in this case and looking at climate-related impacts at a window of about 50 or plus years. You identify courses of actions, you evaluate them with models. These are all good things and we'll still continue them. We determine the cost of the potential adaptations and we compare that to the cost of doing nothing. And you've come up with a cost-beneficial project to drive investment. And then we implement the projects over time and then track to see how well they perform. The changes we've made to that system in what we call an adaptive resilience planning process is we retain most of the things in the traditional planning process, but we have this requirement for a remain functioning condition. A colleague of mine uses this a lot, but essentially what we're talking about is between the time you actually plan your project and that future condition you're aiming for, you want to make sure that the system doesn't break in the middle someplace. And so your analysis should look through time and make sure that your projects are sequenced to avoid you getting into some unacceptable conditions. You want to come up with projects that are properly sequenced and that are adaptable. Also, we want to make sure that we can identify no regret or low regret strategies that can be implemented early. And I'll speak to this a little bit later. So the approach we use can be defined by this model. And it was one of the early decisions we had to make. If you couldn't tell exactly how much sea level rise you'll have in 2085, is there some other way of posing the question that makes our hydrologic tools capable of addressing the question that's been raised? And what we came up with was this approach that says, if you can determine a state or a threshold at which your system stops performing the way you need it to, it might be possible to use that information and the knowledge you have on how long it is to develop a project to determine when you must be risk aware and have initiated a solution. We kind of found that if we could do this with many of our structures. A lot of the things that we do, we were able to rephrase the question in a way that makes our models useful. And we kind of imbibe this or incorporated this into our planning process. This slide essentially shows how that might look like. I retain it only because I want to show that it's not just concrete structures or building gray infrastructure. It could also be operational changes or regulatory changes. Each would require a slightly different time frame. And if you are looking on this slide, for example, if you were doing something that was related to, can you see my mouse? If you're doing something that's related to an operation, you might have a short time frame. It could be something you could do early. And if it's something that's a construction, you might need a longer time frame to permit, plan, and implement it. And you might be able to start that later if you can implement operations or regulatory changes that buy you some time. This is the same slide. I grayed out the background, retained it only to show the 3 different time frames. And I just use this to reinforce the remain functioning concept. If the red is some system response relative to a threshold, an acceptable threshold of performance, you have a system today that is slowly getting worse, and you want to make sure that you keep implementing solutions in some way that makes sure that you don't trip that threshold, you don't reach that tipping point. Now, some of them could be small lifts, and some of them could be big lifts. If you're looking at something that has to do with maybe a structure, a major structure or construction. Okay, so I'll go ahead and move on. Actually, this slide shows one more piece. It shows you what happens if you have the essentially no action, which is always something we compare against. And then it shows you what happens with each of those interventions over time, preventing you from reaching that threshold, which is the black line. I'm going to use a case study on the CHC9 basin in Miami-Dade, Broward County, right there in the map that I'm showing, blown up. The map to your right shows the CHC9 basin. The green outline around it just shows that the model extends beyond the basin. And we did what we call an adaptation and mitigation planning study in this basin, which was looking for where we had challenges with flooding and what kind of solutions or adaptations might we recommend to resolve those problems. We used a very comprehensive approach. And in that approach, we assembled adaptation strategies. We used hydrologic models to test those strategies. We looked at current conditions and future conditions, looked at different combinations of sea level rise based on the thresholds at which some of our structures would potentially no longer be efficient. We looked at different return frequencies of rainfall. We looked at potential solutions that included gray infrastructure or blue-green infrastructure, because that's something that we heard very clearly that the stakeholders were interested in. And we gathered all of those potential adaptations into a number of beams. There's the M0, which is do nothing, no action. There's the M1, which captured a lot of the local projects. There could be anything from seawalls, local pumps that pump into the primary system. Then we looked at a suite of regional projects, the M2 solutions, and then we looked at non-structural or land use type solutions. And we put all of this through the models to try to see how the flood risk in the area would respond to those potential models. I'm beginning to show a few slides that some of you familiar with DAPP may start to recognize. One important thing with this approach is you need to be able to pick some kind of a threshold over which you would assume that your measure has reached a tipping point and you need to move to another particular measure. For our project, the tipping point or the threshold we picked was the expected annual damage. It was an economic metric, and it's a difficult one to select, but we landed on this particular one. We've used it in a previous study in the past, and it was one that we felt would allow us to compare things to current conditions. So essentially, what this plot is saying you, the plot to your right, is that your black line is the expected annual damage under current conditions. Now, as you have different sea level rise conditions, your blue line, which is your no action condition, shows a worsening or increased annual damage. That's the damage from flooding. Your different solution suites or alternatives will shift that line down. But at some point, each one of those lines will intersect the black line, which represents its tipping point, at the point at which that solution no longer meets all your needs, and you need to consider adding something or transferring to another solution set. Now, there are a set of lines at the very bottom that never reach the threshold. Those are the structural solutions or land use solutions. They will work, but they may be extremely expensive to implement. In this case, it was a matter of maybe elevating roads and elevating structures. The area still floods, but you don't see damages. And since our metric is about economic damages, you see a reduction in the damages, and you don't go to the threshold within the time frame of most of our analysis. So what did the results show us? This is using the C8 watershed as an example. We have this DAPP metro line look or feel or graphic that many of you may have seen. What it shows is that if you implement just the M1 solutions, which would be that set in blue, that they have essentially a short life before they get to their tipping point. They represent approximately about maybe about half a foot of sea level rise. If you did the M2A solution set, it lasts you a little bit longer, and it will be able to handle or manage the flood risk based on your threshold a little bit better, going to about maybe 0.8 foot of sea level rise. If you do the M2B, you get a little bit more. You're able to do a foot, maybe a foot and a half of sea level rise, and M2C would handle 2 feet of sea level rise. If you put different sea level rise projections and align them to the amount of sea level rise, you'll be able to kind of take this information and infer some time from it. So taking a look at this, for example, you're saying that your M1 solutions, the blue solutions, would probably only last you to between 2037, maybe 2031, 2037, which is just around the corner. So you must have other solutions if you are looking for the long term. So this is the result essentially for the C8 watershed. We had something similar done for the C9 watershed, and the C9 is in slightly more dire straits than the C8, as the M1 solution in this area is actually, I think, looking at only addressing about 0.4 foot of sea level rise, and you may be looking at moving to something else as soon as 2030. But one of the things that we learned from this study, which was a rude awakening for us, was many of the strategies we've planned, while they do provide benefit, would only at this point address increase in sea level rise in the range of about 2 feet before we have to go into some of the more drastic and very seriously expensive solutions that could really address the long-term problem. So,
Akin, you've got about 3 or 4 minutes left.
Tracking. So, so what are some of the things we learned from this? Doing nothing has a cost. There's significant uncertainty, and how to make better near-term decisions is important. We believe that tools like DAPP may be the difference between doing a really great job that sits on a shelf and actually having an implementable and implemented plan. We've learned a few things, and there are some challenges that I summarize on the slides. The whole threshold approach is not easy to resolve. Thresholds are hard to set for some things. Stakeholder risk acceptance changes even during your study. You get into many studies thinking you know what the stakeholders want. You come out of it after they see the results, realizing they might want something quite different. For a regional effort, the threshold concept is hard to deal with. We have some challenges that we're still trying to address. I kind of mentioned one of them has to do with the fact that we're trying to make sure that our projects are ultimately equitable. And we're learning quickly that some of the tools we have lend themselves to a particular type of solution, which may be different than the objectives of the folks who want to plan solutions in the future. These are some of the lessons learned and things that we're already incorporating in the new studies we're doing. We're exploring the use of emulators that run these does this analysis a lot faster than robust hydrologic and hydraulic models, which are unfortunately very computationally intensive. We believe that this type of tools will allow us sort through more alternative and combinations of solutions, and would also allow us to better integrate stakeholders in some of the trade-offs of the decision making. We also believe that it's going to be very important in our future projects to improve the mix of the projects that we incorporate in each of the alternatives that we take forward. There are a few things that I would be happy to share. I'm going to go ahead and skip through this. I'm just going to do a quick plug. We're always looking to add to the team, but I'll skip that for today. Watch that at your own leisure, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Akin. Any questions? We've got about a minute for question. Anyone want to raise their hand or pop something in the chat? More than welcome to.
It
No
looks like
questions.
Allison has
Oh.
a question. Her hand is
Oh.
raised.
Oh, great, Allison. Yeah, sorry, maybe I'm not seeing things. Go ahead, Allison.
Thank you, Akin, for a great presentation. I've been, CCAP from Philadelphia Water has been looking into adaptive management plans. And I think DAPP is, this is a really good example of implementing DAPP. I do have a question about the different thresholds and tipping points you use, because I think, there was one instance where the threshold was based on economic damage costs or like annual damage costs. And then it seemed like other thresholds are based on the useful service life of the asset. So I was wondering, like, how did you prioritize which threshold measure to use?
Yeah. So the threshold we used was actually based on the total analyzed damage cost. And the definition of the threshold is one of the more challenging things you're going to have to do. Because at the end of the day, you're trying to define where you want to bring your system ultimately. For our study, we used the annualized damage because we kind of felt that most planning and investment were based on a cost-benefit type analysis, and you want to look at the cost of doing something versus the cost of doing nothing. And so we kind of felt that was a good metric that will directly support a decision. Now, we kind of learned quickly after this one study that we do not monetize all the benefits well. Flood damage with a foot of water in a house is easy to calculate, and there are tools that we have and that we use for doing that type of assessment. But the damage from maybe water quality deterioration or ecological damage, we are unable to quantify, and we believe that to properly select projects, it will be important to somehow find a way to bring those numbers in. And we're working to rectify that. We're doing some work with local government to see if we can come up with economic models that allow us to show a cost for some of those things. But for the purposes of this study, our focus was on, what would be the damage avoidance from building the infrastructure. And for that purposes, the EAD seemed to make sense.